Uh, Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the kind invitation, Ashwin, and everyone else. Yeah, I'm really excited to present our. It's funny to say pilot study because it started off as a 6 months pilot study and now it's going on for over 3 years. So I don't even know if I should still call it pilot study and just a project. I don't know. But yeah, I'd love to talk to you about today about the gender and IoT work that we're doing at UCL. I have thought it would be handy to use today's session because I do not know, I have looked at like, Digital Futures seminar series and the background, but I suspect there will be a very diverse audience in this room, from technologists to potential social scientists, to, I don't know, sometimes there's ethicists, philosophers in presentations as well. So I thought it might be helpful to address 3 points: the what, the why, and the how of what I'm going to be talking about, technology facilitated abuse. I also want to start this presentation by emphasizing that we're covering a topic that may be, very sensitive, and for some of you could be something very personal that you have been affected with, or friends have and family have been affected with. So please do consider, taking care of yourself. And if you actually want to reach out afterwards to me to talk about this, I'm happy to do so as well. Just so you have the support infrastructures in place. So I'm going to be talking about what is technology facilitated abuse. This is this big term that I'm using in my research, and why is it important, and how can we start to address this, both from a societal but also in a technical perspective. So let me start by the question of what is technology facilitated abuse, which is what really the research is about. Now, I normally call, in German, we say big bucket. I don't know if it translates so well into the English, but like, I consider technology facilitated abuse as a really big bucket, because the core problem we're facing with this concept is, it doesn't even need to be restricted to the domestic violence or intimate partner violence sector. Technically, technology facilitated abuse, just you looking at that term, could also be, bullying, online bullying, etc. But I specifically zoom in onto this IPV, intimate partner violence space, where support sectors that work with victims and survivors of intimate partner violence would normally categorize anything from text messaging, so the excessive text messaging of a partner, to the impersonation of a partner, to, for example, do tax records, or even like go to pick up kids by impersonating someone, to more technically, I wouldn't necessarily say sophisticated, because in many ways there are not really sophisticated technologically, but still require a bit more than like just sending a text messages. Issues such as stalkerware, which is malicious software that can be installed on devices such as a tablet, laptop, or a smartphone to do geolocation tracking, but also, for example, read or even delete messages. What is very, very widespread is, unfortunately, the use of trackers. Many of these trackers are repurposed. They are, for example, used as trackers for pets or even in the policing service, but then are being, smuggled into a car or put into a purse of someone, and they don't even know that they are there, up to the concept of image-based abuse. Now, I don't know how the discussion is going currently in Sweden around this, but certainly in the UK and to my knowledge, also in the rest of Europe, France, Germany, Austria, there's a lot of discussion around like what is commonly referred to as revenge porn, but we prefer in this space to not talk about it, because there is this anticipation with revenge porn that there is a revenge to be had, and that there is a pornographic element to it. And often we'd rather call it image-based abuse, because, for example, intimate pictures are being taken, or upskirting, the upskirting event of like taking a picture of a woman standing in a tube and just like taking a pictures up her skirt. Anything like that is falling under this category of using images of a person, or associated images from that person, in a way that they have not consented to. So you can see that this is a really wide range of technology facilitated abuse forms that we're seeing. What they all really have in common is that there's often a misuse and a repurposing of technologies that, designers have chosen to design for a specific purpose, but then like they found a different use in a more malicious way against an individual. What I would say, they are often focused on conventional technologies. And what I mean with that is they're kind of things that we have already for a very long time in our households, like laptops, like smartphones, like tablets. And the research, and again, there is this question of correlation and causation, is very much focused on the abuse with regards to women and Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, so people of color. But again, I wonder how often this is more directly also correlated with the fact that there's more studies on this. But nevertheless, there is enough research showcasing that online harassment is especially prevalent with women and, for example, LGBTQ communities as well. And the other thing that all these activities that I outlined before and have in common is they require us, what I would say, an active commitment by the perpetrator. So, for example, with the tracker example, you would need to put a tracker into someone's purse, for example, or they would need to push a button or install something. So there is an active commitment that requires an action to be taken. And as you will see in a few minutes, when I talk about like the emerging tech sector, there's a transformation that no longer even requires perpetrators to do these things anymore. The other thing I want to stress at the start of this presentation is we have very much predefined ideas of what victim and survivors of domestic abuse looks like. I bet most of us have read articles that showcase women huddling in a corner, probably with their arms above their head, bruised. Whereas I really want to stress, there is domestic abuse and intimate partners takes many shapes and forms. It doesn't have to be solely physical abuse. It can be emotional abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse. The range is very diverse and they can go together but don't need to be. And the same is why I think it's important to add this new category of tech abuse to this list. It's not saying that it's a new form or like something separate. It's just an extension of abuse forms that we have seen through means of technology. And the thing I want to stress is we have predefined ideas, not just about the abuse, but also the perpetrator of who is a legitimate perpetrator. Probably we think of really dodgy individuals, perhaps with a criminal record. It is not necessarily, the esteemed professor. It is not necessarily the neighbor. It is not necessarily my uncle, or my aunt. It is, we have it's nearly a distant perception that we have often of perpetrators and what they have to do in order to categorize as such. And equally, we have, as I said earlier, with the conventional technologies, predefined ideas of what technologies are being used. I see that specifically working with the domestic abuse sector in the UK, because when you're exposed solely to smartphones and tablets, you don't necessarily think of, drones being used in such contexts. And I think that's why I really started this project called Gender and IoT, because I was working in the IoT space beforehand on a postdoc and realized quite quickly in this big consortium that I was, that most of the research was focused on harnessing economic value, a bit on ethics, a bit on the social implications, but we weren't really thinking about what IoT could do to some of the most vulnerable groups in society. So that's why it started off as a pilot study, because I did that basically as a side project during my postdoc, which then just snowballed and became this project that thankfully seems to not be ending. So I wanted to look at what tech abuse is doing to domestic abuse in this environment of changing technologies. And that's why I looked at the Internet of Things, because for those of you who are familiar with the term, it's kind of an umbrella term. So it's not like a technology or one specific things. It is different things, different systems. They all have basically this feature of being smart, although anyone working with IoT will know that they're pretty dumb. But there is this idea that they are previously offline products and services that we used to have, like a kettle, a smart lock, a thermostat, a car, a TV. But now we have given them networked functionality that, again, people call smarts, but means that they basically can communicate with each other and exchange information and data. Now, there's a big bulk of research looking at the risks that derive from IoT, but also the uncertainties it brings with regards to regulation. But of course, an even bigger bulk of research probably on the opportunities that these networked functionalities of devices and systems bring. But I was primarily concerned in the research group that we've established on thinking about like what the functionalities that are embedded in this system could mean to domestic abuse victims, who are a very specific, you know, category of people. If you think about like the needs of yourself, the needs of your children or your partner, the needs of your grandparents, each one has a different need and threat model as well. So we looked at the threat model basically of intimate partner violence victims. And so we looked at like some of the features that are embedded in these systems and technically would be beneficial for the average user, but could have detrimental effects for some of the victims and survivors that we have been engaging as part of our research. So for example, the voice control aspect, you know, is something that like seems pleasing, although I have to say most of the time, I would say 7 out of 10 times my Alexa doesn't understand me. You know, it allows like a perpetrator to, for example, control things remotely in a way that like they wouldn't have before. The audio recording is both a good thing and a bad thing in this regard, but again, it allows whoever is account holder and system who owns and has the legal, you know, and the authentication requirements is really in power here. The video recording is something we're particularly concerned with, and we see and saw with regards to smart televisions that in the last years have moved away from using video cameras, but in I would say the last 4 years, there was a phase where there was more video cameras embedded into them. The extent of data collection that comes with IoT is also, you know, the sheer breadth of information you can gather out of a system of these systems is you know, extremely dangerous for a person that wants to conceal, for example, when they're home, when they're getting up, how they're using certain devices. Really worrying is the feature of shared accounts. You know, we're thinking here that you can link different accounts, and we've seen that already with platforms that you can use one single Facebook account to log into different devices and platforms. But like, if you think from pure research, we know that like, the basic abuse perpetrator tends to be in full control of the devices and account that victims and survivors hold. So they really have no means of escaping, like, for example, requirements to share and link accounts with each other. Location tracking, again, a super dangerous feature for domestic abuse victims that may try to escape and conceal where they are. Yeah, the remote control aspect is the most worrying for us, that you don't have to physically be co-present with a person to change features. We, for example, looked at IoT smart light bulbs and realized some of them are so poorly configured that the simple need for being in the same Wi-Fi network is enough to basically control them. So if you have a one-night stand, so we kind of did like anticipated if we were really nasty individual, and you can just stand outside the house the next day in a 30-meter range and could still control those lighting systems without the person probably knowing what's going on. And I think the last point, the machine learning one, is one that I'm personally extremely interested in, but have not had a chance to look more into. And I think there will be more in the future. One of the biggest worries I have is, if you think about domestic abuse takes years. It's like most victims and survivors are not leaving, you know, the minute something happens. They often stay with a partner, leave, come back. But in this time, you know, data is being collected, a profile is being collected. And I do wonder what that means in the future in an environment where you're so reliant on these profiles to be accredited for, you know, for a loan, or just like in an environment where these information about your preferences is needed, what that would mean to victims and survivors that never could be themselves, and like basically have a distorted profile of themselves online that is not reflective of who they really are, but basically marked by the abusive experience that they had in the past. So yeah, we kind of, I mean, we're not coining this, but like we did talk about like kind of, is this a new form of smart abuse that is different to the tech abuse things we have seen before? And we tried to also kind of communicate that information of all the, so we did a lot of tests with IoT devices, we did interviews and focus groups with the support sector in the UK. And we realized quite quickly in the start of the study that we were a bit like 3 steps ahead of what is actually happening, which there can be multiple factors and reasons for that. One, when we started in 2018, January, IoT was not as widespread. The other thing was also that the support sector to this very day actually is still overfilled with other requirements that they have to look out for. So tech abuse is not necessarily something they had, all of them had on the radar. So it was our mission as well to not just like treat it as an average research exercise of studying, publishing, and then moving on. But because I personally had to get a lot of street credit in these communities, because I came as an outsider and they were like, rightfully so, suspicious of like, are you yet another person that comes, service us, and then leaves? I took the approach of first, before we even published things, delivering resources to the sector so they knew we were trustworthy to engage with and would not just leave them. So we developed this material, for example, to kind of explain to support workers, but also actually to policy officials, the risks that derive from IoT based on the things that we have heard in the sector, but also in our research came up and hopefully eased the way we communicated information with them. Now that we've established what tech abuse is and what we're doing, why does this really matter? Well, it doesn't come as like, to the audience that I suspect is here in this room, it's not like surprising that technology has positive and negative outcomes. But I do think it's important to reflect upon what Matthews and others have nicely addressed as like, we need to think about the positives and negatives in the regards to the stages of abuse that are happening. So there is these alleged 3 phases of IPV or IPA, which is intimate partner violence abuse, where you normally have a phase where a victim and survivor is under physical control. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they are physically violent or that someone is physically violent with them, but that they are, for example, sharing accounts, sharing a living environment. And the features that IoT systems offer during that phase are often, abused and misused against them because the account holder, the person in charge, the person in authority and who's often the perpetrator, will misuse the devices. The second phase is the escape phase, and the features that we're seeing being abused can actually potentially be both accelerating the abuse or accelerating the abuse, but also can be helpful in this environment. But what is important to recognize in the escape phase is that this is the highest risk phase. Most homicides happen during this phase. So giving a person the wrong advice, or for example, saying you should just change your password, or you should just set 2-factor authentication on your Google doorbell or whatnot, mean that things can escalate and they can be further endangered. So we also realized quite quickly, we can't just make a black and white, do this, do that list, because it is dependent on the risk profile of that person and in which stages of abuse they are at. And the third phase of the life apart phase is when they have, for example, gone through a court process, have a protection order against a perpetrator, and like try to rebuild their life. That's actually when we see most victims and survivors really longing for IoT, for the same features that have used to oppress them, but now that they're in charge of these devices, they actually would like to have smart systems installed because they are the ones that can control them, but also they are the ones that, for example, can use them to check if someone is at the door, check if someone's in the garden, etc. So that makes this whole situation really difficult because it's not just that like I can say we should stop remote control of systems, rather it depends of who is in control. And I mean, it doesn't come as news to the audience probably here that this makes it problematic. The other thing we looked at as part of our research was like kind of most of the devices are not necessarily designed with security in mind. Again, having been first in the IoT space and then coming more into this domestic abuse space, I can see why. Like, you know, you have assumptions about what would be a cool feature, but you don't necessarily think what security or safety implications could that have as a consequence of this being used. And often, you know, purely from an economic point of view, you'd rather have these features because you can collect more data and use that to profile, you know, your users better. So this is a core problem which, you know, I don't think our research can address, but we certainly see this as an issue and a stumbling block. One thing that we have been vouching for quite some time is the idea that we need to develop an intimate partner threat model. And that goes along with the critique that, like, if most of the development that happens currently is looking at like kind of external threat actors, and that's why I put a couch here, most of us are not necessarily thinking when we design systems and devices that the exact person that we are sharing a couch or a bed with may be the person that does us harm. So, and it's really, I think, threat modeling for an intimate partner threat actor is far harder than for an external threat actor, because it's not just about building walls. Not even, I mean, most of us know that we can't just build walls anyway, but you know, it requires a lot of concealing, and also the trade-off of using concealing methods or deceptive methods could potentially endanger the victim even further. So threat modeling is something that needs to happen better with regards to the intimate partner violence context. What is for me particularly worrying is after 3 years, like we're still in this phase, I would say, in a society where there is a hype. I mean, I'd say IoT is a bit died down, AI is the new thing. But like still in the news, in the television, you hear about these things, and a lot of people are extremely worried about them. They have this fear. It goes back to nearly to this privacy paradox where you think, well, I am scared about it, or I do care about this, but I still do something like that. And what we've seen working with the support sector is one problem is that many of these devices are disguised. So, I mean, they could look like the average like kettle, or they can look like just like a normal thermostat. So that makes it hard for even like victims to assess, but also, for example, for the domestic abuse sector to assess. The other thing is they have these enhanced functionalities that, like, you know, you don't really know how enhanced they are. And that brings me to the really important point. Both the overestimation as well as the underestimation of these functionalities are equally as harmful. And I'm saying this because we have heard from support sector services that have asked us specific questions about what some of these devices can do. And as you can envision, many of the perpetrators deliberately tell victims and survivors lies and say, oh, I'm such a hacker, I have friends in the dark web, and like I can do these things, and this device can do these things. Whereas then they are not sure if they can trust fully what they're saying. And they can use that both in regards to exaggerating the functionalities, but also telling them that they do not have these functionalities. And that really is a critical moment we're at now, when most of us have like these Black Mirror-esque ideas of what tech can do, when the reality, as I said earlier, most of these devices are actually quite dumb. So, so that is, I think, that is an educational aspect that we in our research need to address. So really the underestimation and the overestimation is something, I think, I normally say, if you take anything away from this presentation, let it be this one. And I also want to stress, we're working like very closely with the support sector. We have done interviews, focus groups, surveys, like you name it. And a general tenor and response we receive is like the support sector, you have to envision the people that work with victims and survivors, they're their point of contact for everything. Like often they have to give them legal advice, they have to be nearly psychologists to give them health and mental advice. They need to think about like housing issues, and now we're asking them to also know tech. And that just doesn't work, because in our interviews, most of the people that we spoke to, their immediate reaction was, I'm not a techie. I know this is a problem, but I don't, you know, they already themselves have anxieties about touching these devices, which, you know, means that, like, you know, they feel like not capable of like supporting victims sufficiently. Another really big problem we've seen in as a consequence of our research is the lack of data. So, I mean, we've collected primary data through the interviews and focus group surveys and like the tests of devices, but secondary information is actually relatively hard to find. Now, I have a project currently with 2 PhD students that like we're looking at existing data and use machine learning and natural language processing to go through databases of that may, you know, hint at tech abuse being there. But, you know, I think we're only at the start of this process of developing a means to, for example, not just scrape data, but look at data that domestic abuse services have collated and look at if tech abuse is in there. And why is that necessary? Because currently domestic abuse services don't explicitly collect that data. They don't have a tick box. And that goes back to the fact that we don't have a clear definition, and that the sheer breadth of factors that could be considered tech abuse is so broad. I mean, again, but we do have some hints, like from my point, I mean, 100% probably all of the cases have some form of tech element, because most of us have a phone. So excessive text messaging is definitely going to happen. So if we lower the threshold of tech abuse to this, then tech abuse probably 100% happening everywhere. Refuge is one of the support sectors in the UK that is one of the first ones to collect explicitly tech abuse data. So they have a tech abuse tick box, which is fantastic. And I'm trying my best to get other services also to jump on the boat and do the same. And yeah, Women's Aid are also thinking of like kind of approximately 85% of their support sector, the victims that they support are facing tech abuse. One thing, and again, this is specific to the UK, but I bet could be equally applicable to Sweden, is, you know, we have certain kind of rules in the UK around counting rules of recorded crime. And only in order to get a representative sample of like information around how widespread tech abuse is and how widespread, for example, specifically IoT abuses, we need to, for example, look at a, you know, national representative survey method, and the counting rules of recorded crimes, while this would be specific to the police services, and again, not most domestic abuse victims would not report to the police, would still give us more information than we have now. Equally, national statistics, such as in the UK, we have the British Crime Survey, would be helpful if we would include a category on this phenomena. And the same would apply, I'm sure, for Sweden too. One of the biggest challenges, I think, is with regards to risk assessment. And I'm mentioning this because any victim and survivor that goes and seeks help in a support service, the first thing they will do is do a risk assessment. And this is a screening. In the UK, it's a standardized screening test, but there are only some questions that hint at tech abuse. So if they're not explicitly prompted for that, they could not disclose, for example, whether they're wearing any wearables, whether they have IoT systems at home, and thinking and prompting the victim to consider these as potentially compromised systems. Which brings me to the safety plan, which is the second step of any engagement with the support sector, which is after your risk has been assessed and they, for example, realize, okay, you're 25-year-old woman with a migration background who barely speaks any English and is using these types of devices, is pregnant, which increases the factors even further. They think about a safety plan to make sure that, you know, you're safe either if you choose to stay with the perpetrator, but also if you choose to leave. From our research, most services account for smartphones and laptops, but they do not account for other tech like IoT or obscure things like drones. Only what is fascinating is once it has become salient, so for example, Xboxes are a good example. So some services, and that often boils down to an individual, that one service a worker or a frontline worker has experienced someone that has been abused through an Xbox, and then they are aware of it and continue to ask about this. But again, it requires this awareness at the first place to explicitly ask about it and then also model for it. So we think it would be essential for that to be explicitly included in all these programs. Equally, this is something, a new thing that I'm really interested in, and should I ever get funding, I'd love to work on, is perpetrator programs. So there is perpetrator programs in many, like often on a voluntary basis or semi-voluntary, where perpetrators of domestic abuse are basically have the chance to reflect upon their action and hopefully see means to improve and become better. And there's not much work, and there's not much like inclusion of tech abuse in perpetrator program prevention programs. So this is something I think would be fascinating, and is a blind spot in regards to how that could be properly accounted for in these training sessions with them. And with regards to research, I mean, the research body is growing, which is great. I would still say it's very much focused on the US and Australia, where there's certain kind of research hubs, but also expertise in the voluntary sector that drives that forward. Which brings me to the question, how can we hopefully, improve this situation? And one of the core things, I mean, Azreen was saying, I'm in a department with a very, very long title, Steep Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy. Of course, the first thing I grab to is policy. And I see in the UK a unique opportunity, because there's currently certain developments happening that would allow for certain alignment between certain policy areas that touch upon tech abuse, but are currently kept in silo. And I've just received funding from Home Office in the UK to actually examine the Computer Misuse Act, which is probably the core legislation when it comes to unauthorized access and its applicability to tech abuse. But before that, I was always preaching that it's needed that we align cybercrime legislation with domestic abuse legislation and stalking and harassment legislation, which are all separate in the UK. And that they all need to properly account for tech abuse, which is currently not existing there. I mean, it's in cybercrime, but cybercrime thinks again about external threat actors, about hackers and terrorists, but it's not the intimate partner violence dimension that would need it to be there. Equally, I'm having looked at what's happening globally. I think one core thing that is being dealt with on how tech abuse, whether on IoT or just on smartphones, is being addressed is through centralization. And what I mean with that is, in Australia, for example, there is a dedicated service called eSafety Commissioner, which is a public body that gives advice for elderly, for kids, for parents, but also for domestic abuse victims. And they develop resources, they have like a reporting platform, but I don't know about Sweden, but in the UK, we do not have a service like that. The voluntary sector is dispersed, which in itself is not the problem. But like, as I said earlier, the average frontline worker has a background perhaps in social work, but they are not tech experts. And what they would like from our research and having looked at Australia would be some form of, for example, on a helpline that the sector could call and say, I'm sitting here with a victim that and they have done the risk assessment as well, which is important because, as I said earlier, you can't just tell someone to change functionalities if you know that they're still living with a partner or not planning to leave, because that could flag something negatively. And then they could walk them through ways. And on the other end, there's a person that is both familiar with, I don't know, Android phones and different stalkerware systems, can walk them through, but also has the, social capability of knowing under which stress the victim is, and what that they are familiar, that like the person on the other end might not know, I don't know what hashing is, I don't know, like, any, like that they are considered as well, that they can't just do text speak, which, yeah, is actually quite difficult. Which brings me to two things. Number one is there's a really fascinating development in Cornell Tech where they're offering tech abuse clinics. Basically, they have this fantastic research team that is working with a domestic abuse service in New York, and they basically allow these. So some of the victims that are flagged for high risk with tech abuse, they then are allowed to come into this clinic and get specialized support. So their phones are scanned. and their settings are changed in alignment with the risk assessment, but together with computer scientists and social scientists that are working in this clinic. And I think this is fascinating. And I have this dream that we could do something similar at UCL. It reminds me a lot on what's happening with regard to legal clinics, where legal scholars are not just expected to, study law, but perhaps spend some time and give legal advice for free pro bono. And I think, how great would that be if we would get more socially considered computer scientists out of a computer science degree at UCL, if they would have spent some time and giving advice to victims and survivors. But yeah, I should still find funding for that. And equally, we have tried this at UCL. And I mean, I loved it. I'd love to run it again. What we did, I'm a big crypto party fan. So if you're not familiar with crypto parties, it's basically a public movement where anyone who feels like they can give advice, but also if you look for advice, can go to a so-called crypto party, and there's an angel, which basically is an average human being that knows a bit more about certain aspects, tells you what you could do. Now, I mean, we can have a whole discussion around how do you ensure quality of the people that give advice, etc. But what we did is we did a dedicated crypto party with the domestic abuse sector in the UK. We had different tables on different topics, like, for example, one on secure communication, one on phone security, one on online browsing security. And we had angels, I mean, we vetted them on each table to ensure that they can give the support sector advice. And I think it was very well received. It is relatively hard to organize, especially in a climate like with COVID currently, but I think it certainly is worth doing. And again, I think that gave us street credit with the support sector, that we're not the kind of standard researchers that just come and then off we go and just publish and never will be seen again. And which brings me also to responsible of public organizations, such in the UK, the National Cybersecurity Centre, which I do believe Sweden has an NCSC as well, who could step up in such roles if they wanted to, if there were funding. We shall see. I'm a big outspoken about this. I don't know if the NCSC will ever listen, but if they do, I hope they will credit me for bringing domestic abuse into the NCSC. And the last point I want to mention is from our research, we have also some pointers for industry, which derive a good portion derived from these tests that we have done on IoT devices, also with colleagues in Australia, where in many ways, it's just the standard HCI, human-computer interaction findings of like, make it easier, make it understandable. And especially for domestic abuse victims, it's important to have received prompts and notifications. Equally, I mean, they can be dangerous. So if the prompts come to the wrong person, but still, like, for example, the frequent notification, do you still want to connect this device with another, which currently doesn't happen. Alexa hasn't given me any indication for a while who of my friends still have access to my Alexa since they have visited me. So things like that would be important. But also, for example, customer staff guidance would be essential, because we do see that many are phoning phone services or IoT vendors, and then they might not get the right information because they are not risk assessed. And then someone at the other end just says, do password reset or factory reset, which then could flag and escalate things with the perpetrator. Yeah, and IBM and others are already trying to pick these things up and starting to think about, like, are we as a company already starting to address these issues internally? So yeah, I mean, that was a very broad overview that I hope still gave some pointers at what we have been doing, where we're at. And I mean, I could talk far more about all of this, but just to say, I think the core things that I think are essential and derived from our research is we need more data and better data to basically quantify this thing, because from my end, I think the two things I get asked most by journalists and by policymakers is how widespread is this problem, followed by what should we do? And I think we need an answer to the quantification question, because it seems like even if we hypothesize it's 85%, they want the fixed number, preferably also with a clear pointer at who is responsible. Like, it's 60% Google Smart Home. I don't know, I'm making things up, but like they want that. And I think it's needed to make sure that policy aligns. I do think the risk assessment, the safety plans need to be adjusted in the UK, at least. Again, I can't speak for Sweden. the alignment of policy would be very quickly done if there would be will and interest of government departments to work together. Equally, I think there needs to be a pressure on industry to pick this up as not necessarily a new issue, because I mean, this has happened all the time, but at least to account for it in, for example, the product design. And last but not least, we need some more support for the support sector, because they have so much other things on their radar, and leaving them alone with this issue is not gonna solve this. So I just gonna shamelessly point you to our wonderful newsletter that I'm running. That's my Saturdays, spending collating monthly newsletter content. But we do try to give information on like kind of latest international developments in this tech abuse space, and also updates on our research. So if you're interested and would like to be kept up to date, please do sign up. So yeah, I hope, I'm 42 minutes. I don't know if that was wanted, hoped for, but I'm really looking forward to questions and any concerns, queries, anything like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leonie.